To understand Australia's secret role in Vietnam, you need to understand why they were there in the first place. In 1962, when President John F. Kennedy was escalating American involvement in Southeast Asia, Australia's conservative government, under Robert Menzies, faced a strategic dilemma. Indonesia, with a population 20 times larger than Australia's, was becoming increasingly aggressive under President Sukarno. The threat of communist expansion in Southeast Asia was not an abstract ideological concern for Australians. It was a matter of national survival. Australia's northern approaches were vulnerable. The nation had a small population of just over 10 million people in the early 1960s, with most concentrated in coastal cities thousands of miles from potential threats. They needed powerful allies. They needed American commitment to regional security. And they needed to prove their value as a strategic partner. The decision to send military advisors to Vietnam in August 1962 was calculated. Australia would demonstrate its willingness to fight alongside America in the struggle against communism, securing American goodwill and commitment to Australian defense. But the Menzies government did something remarkably different from the Americans. Instead of sending conventional troops en masse, they sent specialists, 30 men from the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, hand-picked experts in jungle warfare, counterinsurgency, and unconventional operations. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were combat veterans who had fought communist insurgents in Malaya during the emergency, men who understood jungle warfare in ways that American forces, trained for European battlefields and nuclear conflict, simply did not. Colonel Ted Sarong, the officer tasked with establishing this elite unit, selected his men based on criteria that would prove prescient. They needed combat experience. They needed to speak Vietnamese or demonstrate the ability to learn quickly. They needed to survive and operate independently in hostile environments for extended periods. They needed to train indigenous forces who were often poorly motivated, sometimes corrupt, and frequently suspicious of foreign advisors. And perhaps most importantly, they needed to improvise, adapt, and overcome obstacles without the massive logistical support American forces took for granted. From the beginning, the Australian approach to Vietnam was fundamentally different from the American model. Where American advisors often remained in secure compounds and relied on interpreters, Australian advisors lived in the villages with South Vietnamese troops. Where American strategy emphasized firepower and attrition, Australian doctrine emphasized intelligence, stealth, and precision. Where American operations followed predictable patterns, Australian methods were fluid, unconventional, and often impossible for the enemy to anticipate. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam would become the most decorated unit of the entire war, winning all 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians during the conflict. But their conventional decorations tell only part of the story. What made them truly valuable was not the battles they fought in the open, but the networks they built in the shadows. Some members of the team worked with regular Army of the Republic of Vietnam units and formations. Others operated with the Montagnard Hill tribes in the Central Highlands in conjunction with American Special Forces. A select few became involved in something far more controversial. They became part of the Phoenix program, the CIA's most secret and most brutal counterinsurgency operation of the war. The Phoenix program was designed to target the Viet Cong infrastructure through infiltration, capture, interrogation, and, when deemed necessary, assassination. Between 1968 and 1972, the Phoenix program neutralized over 81,000 people suspected of Viet Cong membership, Of these, 26,000 were killed. The program was designed, coordinated, and executed by the Central Intelligence Agency with participation from United States Special Operations Forces and a small number of Special Forces operatives from the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. The Australian involvement in Phoenix was deliberate and methodical. Documents that have since been declassified reveal that Australian advisors were selected for Phoenix operations based on their language skills, cultural understanding, and demonstrated ability to gather intelligence through unconventional means. Some operated as part of provincial reconnaissance units, the teams that conducted the actual capture and elimination missions. Others worked in regional interrogation centers where intelligence was extracted, often through methods that violated every principle of the Geneva Conventions. Australian participation in Phoenix remains one of the most controversial aspects of their involvement in Vietnam. The program operated in a legal and moral gray zone that troubled even some of its participants. Former members of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, who worked with Phoenix, have described operations where suspected Viet Cong infrastructure members were targeted based on intelligence that was often unreliable, sometimes fabricated, and occasionally motivated by personal vendettas rather than military necessity. The provincial reconnaissance units, which included Australian advisors, were described by critics as assassination squads. Supporters argued they were a necessary response to an enemy that operated among the civilian population, using terror and intimidation to control villages and hamlets throughout South Vietnam. What is undeniable from the declassified documents is that Australian advisors were valued by the CIA for specific capabilities. They could operate independently for extended periods without the elaborate support structures American personnel required. They had established trust relationships with local forces that American advisors struggled to replicate, and they brought tactics and techniques learned during the Malayan Emergency, where British and Commonwealth forces had successfully defeated a communist insurgency through a combination of military operations, intelligence gathering, and population control measures that were effective but morally questionable. One former CIA officer who worked with Australian advisors in the Phoenix program described their approach in a classified after-action report that was declassified in 2005. The Australians understood that effective counterinsurgency requires living among the population, not just patrolling through it. They were willing to take risks that American personnel, constrained by bureaucracy and risk-averse commanders, would not accept, and they delivered results without requiring the massive resources that American operations consumed. But Phoenix was only one aspect of Australia's secret war. Far from the interrogation centers and targeted operations of the Phoenix program, another group of Australians was conducting a different kind of secret war. This war was fought not with bullets and interrogations, but with radio intercepts and cryptanalysis. In April 1966, as part of an agreement between Australian and United States military and intelligence authorities, a decision was made to deploy 500 Nordiaban signal troop to Vietnam. Their mission was to provide signals intelligence support to the 1st Australian Task Force and Allied forces operating in Phuoc Toi Province. The troop consisted of 2 officers and 35 other ranks, specialists in intercepting enemy communications and identifying locations through direction-finding facilities. What made 540th Signal Troop remarkable was not their size, but their effectiveness. The troop was part of Australia's Defence Signals Division, the predecessor to today's Australian Signals Directorate. These were not ordinary soldiers with radios. They were trained cryptanalysts, linguists who spoke Vietnamese, and technical specialists who understood the intricacies of radio propagation and direction finding. The Americans had their own massive signals intelligence apparatus in Vietnam, with thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. But the Australian signals intelligence contribution was valued far beyond what their small numbers would suggest. The reason was simple. American signals intelligence operations in Vietnam were plagued by problems of scale and bureaucracy. Intelligence collected at one location had to be transmitted up multiple levels of command, analyzed, and then disseminated back down to tactical units. The process often took hours or days, by which time the enemy had moved and the intelligence was worthless. The Australians solved this problem through proximity and integration. 547 Signal Troop was located at Nui Dat, the main Australian base in Phuoc Toi Province, directly alongside the task force headquarters. When they intercepted enemy communications, when they located an enemy transmitter through direction finding, when they decrypted a message revealing enemy plans, the intelligence was in the hands of combat commanders within minutes, not hours. The Battle of Long Tan on August 18, 1966, demonstrated both the value and the tragic limitations of this capability. In the days leading up to the battle, 547 Signal Troop operators monitoring enemy radio traffic had detected unusual activity. They identified the radio call sign of the 275th Regiment, a North Vietnamese Army unit that had recently entered Phuoc Toi Province. Through direction finding, they tracked the transmitter as it moved steadily toward the Australian base at Nui Dat over a period of 16 days, covering 17 kilometers in tactical bounds that suggested a deliberate approach for a major attack. The intelligence was passed to Task Force headquarters, but here the system failed. The information from signals intelligence was classified at such a high level that the commander of 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, whose men would soon be fighting for their lives at Long Tan, was not fully briefed on what the signals intelligence had revealed. The need to protect the sources and methods of signals intelligence was considered more important than ensuring that combat commanders had the full picture of the threat they faced. On the afternoon of August 18th, D Company of 6 RAR encountered what they initially believed was a small enemy force near the Long Tan rubber plantation. Within minutes, they realized they were facing not a small unit, but an entire regimental force of over 2,000 North Vietnamese soldiers. The company fought desperately, heavily outnumbered and running low on ammunition. At 5 in the afternoon, with D Company's situation becoming critical, the task force commander finally called the officer commanding 547 Signal Troop to his side and asked for his analysis of the enemy attacking D Company. The signals intelligence officer had no problem responding in detail. His team had been tracking this force for over 2 weeks. They knew its composition, its likely strength, its command structure. If this intelligence had been fully shared with combat units earlier, if the need for secrecy had not outweighed the need for operational effectiveness, the battle might have unfolded very differently. 18 Australians died at Long Tan. 21 were wounded. The enemy left 245 dead on the battlefield and withdrew, their attack on Nui Dat disrupted but not destroyed. The lesson was learned. From that day forward, 547 Signal Troop became an integral part of Australian combat operations in Vietnam. The troop's strength was doubled from 15 to 30 personnel. A research and development project was initiated to equip them with high-frequency airborne radio direction-finding equipment installed in fixed-wing aircraft that could locate enemy transmitters with unprecedented accuracy. The distinction between protecting intelligence sources and actually using intelligence to save lives was recalibrated. Signals. Intelligence operators began accompanying combat units on operations, providing real-time analysis of intercepted communications directly to commanders in the field. The results were dramatic. In one documented incident, operators from 547 Signal Troop intercepted and decrypted enemy radio messages that revealed the evacuation of wounded to a hospital in the Mae Tao Mountains. This single piece of intelligence indicated that a significant attack was imminent, as casualties were usually evacuated to the nearby Hot Deek secret zone. The information was quickly passed up the chain to American forces at Bien Hoa, and the anticipated attack was preempted through artillery strikes and airstrikes on the assembly areas identified through signals intelligence. The commanding general of the United States 9th Infantry Division later described 547 Signal Troops' contribution as outstanding and noted their professionalism in official communications. Between 1966 and 1971, the small unit of Australian signals intelligence specialists provided intelligence that, according to later assessments, saved countless Australian and American lives. They intercepted enemy communications planning attacks. They located enemy headquarters through direction finding. They provided warning of enemy movements that allowed ambushes to be set or avoided. They decrypted messages that revealed supply routes, troop strengths, and operational plans. And they did all of this with a level of operational security so stringent that even many military personnel serving in Vietnam did not know that 547 Signal Troop performed radio intercept and analysis tasks for intelligence purposes. The squadron's wireless intercept role was such a well-kept secret that when the Labour Party won the Australian federal election in 1972, the newly elected Prime Minister Gough Whitlam caused a stir by publicly announcing the previously secret nature of the roles and tasks of signals intelligence units. But by then, the damage to secrecy had already been done by the unit's own success. Their intelligence was so consistently accurate and timely that enemy forces began to suspect their communications were being intercepted. In response, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units changed their communication procedures, switched frequencies more frequently, and reverted to using runners for critical messages. The cat-and-mouse game between signals intelligence and communication security continued throughout the war, with each side adapting to the other's evolving capabilities, while Australian signals intelligence operators listened to enemy communications and Australian advisors worked in the shadows of the Phoenix program. Another Australian unit was conducting operations that would become legendary. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment deployed to Vietnam in 1966, and from their first patrol until their withdrawal in 1971, they created a reputation that transcended conventional military effectiveness and entered the realm of psychological warfare. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, the Phantoms of the Jungle, and that name was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was fear given a name by an enemy who could not see, could not hear, could not predict the silent killers who moved through their territory like smoke. The SAS operated in 5-man patrols that inserted by helicopter and then disappeared into the jungle for weeks at a time. They conducted nearly 1,200 patrols during their time in Vietnam. They killed over 600 enemy soldiers confirmed, with another 106 possibly killed. Their own casualties during this period totaled 1 killed in action. 1 died of wounds. 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. That kill ratio, approximately 100 to 1, was unprecedented in the entire war. But statistics alone cannot capture what made the SAS so effective and so feared. The fear came from their methods, their patience, their absolute commitment to stealth, and their willingness to operate in ways that defied conventional military doctrine. American forces in Vietnam moved through the jungle with a level of noise that shocked Australian advisors who first observed their operations. Equipment rattled, radios crackled, voices carried through the jungle. When American units made contact with the enemy, their immediate response was to call in artillery, helicopter gunships, and airstrikes. The tactics were predictable. Viet Cong commanders described the pattern openly after the war. Engage American forces briefly, inflict casualties if possible, then withdraw before the heavy weapons arrived. By the time American firepower was brought to bear, the enemy was gone. Australian infantry operated more quietly than Americans, patrolled more carefully, relied less heavily on immediate fire support. But they still moved in platoon or company strength. Their positions could be detected. Their patterns could be studied. Their routes could be anticipated. The SAS was something entirely different. They moved so slowly that a patrol might cover less than a kilometer in an entire day. Every few hundred meters, they stopped and sat absolutely still for 30 minutes, just watching and listening. They wrapped every piece of metal equipment in tape to eliminate noise. They mixed mud into their uniforms to kill any shine from fabric or equipment. They did not smoke. They did not cook hot meals. They did not speak above a whisper for weeks at a time in the field. Former Viet Cong fighters, interviewed decades after the war, described the psychological impact of encountering the SAS. You would be moving supplies down a trail you had used safely for months. Suddenly, your point man would collapse without a sound. Then another. Then chaos as automatic weapons fire erupted from positions you had walked past without seeing anything. The engagement would last perhaps 60 seconds, then silence. When reinforcements arrived minutes later, they would find bodies, but no trace of who had killed them. No spent brass, no blood trails, no footprints, just empty jungle that had swallowed the attackers completely. Captured enemy documents from 1967 and 1968 specifically warned Viet Cong units about Australian SAS operations. The documents described tactics to use against American forces, techniques for ambushing Australian infantry, procedures for avoiding airstrikes. But for the SAS, the guidance was simple and chilling. Avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, assume you are already under observation. Assume they know your positions and strength. Assume reinforcement has been called before the first shot is fired. That assumption reveals the psychological warfare the SAS waged without intending to. Every trail became suspect. Every jungle clearing could conceal watchers. Every supply movement risked walking into an ambush that had been prepared days in advance. The SAS did not need to patrol constantly or engage frequently. Their reputation did the work for them. Enemy units operated under perpetual uncertainty, never knowing if 5 silent professionals were observing them at that exact moment. The training that produced this capability was brutal and unforgiving. SAS candidates underwent selection courses that had failure rates exceeding 70%. Those who survived selection entered training programs that taught them to navigate by stars and terrain features, to move through jungle without disturbing vegetation, to observe enemy positions for days without being detected, to survive on minimal rations for extended periods, to call in artillery strikes with pinpoint accuracy, and to kill efficiently at close range with knife, pistol, or rifle. But the real secret of SAS effectiveness was not individual skill. It was operational doctrine based on lessons learned in Borneo and Malaya. The 5-man patrol structure was deliberate. 5 men could move more quietly than a larger unit. 5 men could hide more easily. 5 men created a smaller signature in every measurable way, but 5 men also provided mutual support, overlapping fields of fire in an ambush, and enough firepower to break contact if compromised. The patrol structure also created redundancy. Each patrol member was cross-trained in multiple skills. If the patrol commander was killed, the second in command could take over without missing a beat. If the radio operator was wounded, another patrol member could operate the radio. If the medic was incapacitated, every patrol member had basic medical training. The insertion and extraction procedures were designed to deceive and confuse. Helicopters would fly patterns that made it impossible to determine where. Patrols had actually inserted. Multiple helicopters would land in different locations. Sometimes helicopters would land and take off without actually inserting anyone. Sometimes patrols would insert from one helicopter while another created a diversion elsewhere. Once on the ground, patrols would move in unpredictable directions, doubling back on their own trail, walking in streams to avoid leaving tracks, using every technique to make pursuit or detection impossible. The patrol would then move to its area of operations and establish an observation post, typically in thick vegetation on a ridgeline or hillside that provided good visibility of likely enemy routes. For days, or sometimes weeks, the patrol would observe, taking notes on everything they saw: how many enemy soldiers moved past, what equipment they carried, what direction they were traveling, what time of day they moved, whether they followed a regular schedule, whether they appeared alert or relaxed, whether they checked the trail for ambushes or moved with the confidence of people in their own territory. This intelligence was radioed back to base in encrypted transmissions that enemy signals intelligence could intercept but not decipher. The information was compiled, analyzed, and used to build a comprehensive picture of enemy activity in the area. When enough information had been gathered, when the pattern was clear, the patrol would either call in an airstrike or artillery on an enemy position or set an ambush along a route the enemy used regularly. The ambush itself was an exercise in patience and precision that reflected years of refinement in jungle warfare doctrine. The patrol would select a position with good fields of fire, concealment, and multiple escape routes carefully mapped before they ever entered the area. They studied the terrain with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Every tree, every depression in the ground, every possible line of sight was evaluated and incorporated into the ambush plan. They would clear their fields of fire without leaving obvious signs of disturbance, removing individual leaves and branches rather than cutting swaths that would alert a careful enemy to human presence. They would camouflage themselves so thoroughly that they became indistinguishable from the landscape itself. Face paint in patterns that broke up the human outline, vegetation attached to uniforms, and equipment in arrangements that mimicked natural growth, positions selected to blend with shadows and terrain features. The level of concealment was such that enemy forces sometimes walked within meters of SAS positions without detecting them. Then they would wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The waiting was perhaps the most difficult part of the operation. Remaining absolutely motionless while insects crawled across exposed skin, ignoring thirst and hunger, controlling breathing to minimize sound, resisting the urge to adjust position or relieve, cramping muscles. Every patrol member knew that a single moment of inattention, a single unnecessary movement, could compromise the entire operation and endanger the lives of every man in the patrol. When the enemy finally appeared, moving down the trail with the confidence of people who did not expect contact in their own territory, the patrol would exercise discipline that American forces often found incomprehensible. They would not fire immediately. They would wait until the enemy force was fully committed to the killing zone, with the lead elements past the ambush position and the trailing elements not yet arrived, with no cover available and no escape route that did not require running directly into the patrol's fields of fire. The patrol commander would track each enemy soldier through his sights, calculating range, accounting for wind and vegetation, waiting for the moment when maximum enemy forces were in the optimal position. Then, and only then, would he initiate the ambush with a single aimed shot that killed the enemy commander or the most dangerous-looking soldier in the group. The other patrol members would open fire simultaneously, each man engaging targets in his assigned sector, pouring disciplined aimed fire into the kill zone for perhaps 30 to 60 seconds. The sound was terrifying in its intensity and shocking in its suddenness. The jungle would erupt in violence, and then, as suddenly as it began, the firing would stop. 60 seconds of controlled chaos, and then silence. The patrol would immediately police their brass, collecting spent cartridge cases to avoid leaving evidence that could help the enemy determine their weapons, their positions, or their numbers. They would move immediately to a pre-selected rendezvous point, following an escape route planned before the ambush, moving fast but quietly, putting distance between themselves and the ambush site before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Within minutes, they would be kilometers away, the jungle swallowing them as completely as if they had never existed. They would move toward an extraction point, often different from their insertion point, where a helicopter would pick them up and return them to base. The entire movement, from ambush to extraction, was choreographed with precision, every man knowing his role, every contingency planned for, every action rehearsed until it became instinctive. The entire operation, from insertion to extraction, might last 2 or 3 weeks of continuous operations deep in hostile territory. During that time, the 5-man patrol would operate independently, beyond the reach of conventional support, in territory controlled by the enemy, living on cold rations and moving through landscapes where discovery meant almost certain death. They would achieve results far out of proportion to their numbers, and they would return to base having inflicted significant casualties, gathered critical intelligence, and created psychological impact that conventional operations conducted by larger forces could never achieve. But the SAS was not invincible, and their operations were not without cost. One member was killed in action when he fell from a helicopter during extraction. Another died of wounds received in combat. 3 were killed in accidents that were the inevitable result of conducting high-risk operations in hostile environments. 1 went missing in action, his body not recovered until decades after the war ended. These losses, though statistically small, affected the regiment deeply. In a small, close-knit unit where everyone knew everyone else, every loss was personal. The psychological burden of SAS operations also took its toll in ways that were not immediately apparent. Living for weeks at a time in constant tension, knowing that a single mistake could mean death, operating without the immediate support available to conventional forces, conducting operations that required killing at close range, these experiences left marks that some patrol members carried for the rest of their lives. After the war, some SAS veterans struggled with the transition to civilian life or conventional military service. The intensity of operations in Vietnam, the autonomy they had exercised, the clear sense of purpose and mission created expectations that ordinary existence could not fulfill. Some turned to alcohol, some struggled with relationships, some found it difficult to discuss their experiences even with other veterans because what they had done and seen was so far removed from conventional combat experience. But during the war itself, the SAS was one of Australia's most effective weapons. Their intelligence was consistently accurate. Their kill ratio was unmatched. Their ability to operate in enemy-controlled territory without detection created options for commanders that no other unit could provide. And their psychological impact on enemy forces, the fear and uncertainty they created, was worth far more than the 600 confirmed enemy killed. The combination of signals intelligence, special operations, and participation in controversial programs like Phoenix created a force multiplier effect that made Australia's contribution to the war effort far more significant than their relatively small numbers would suggest. But there was one more aspect of Australia's secret war that has been almost entirely forgotten in popular memory. In February 1968, the Australian government made a decision that shocked critics and surprised allies. They deployed Centurion tanks to Vietnam. The Centurion was a British-designed main battle tank that weighed 52 tons, carried a 20-pounder main gun and multiple machine guns, and had been designed for warfare on the plains of northern Europe against Soviet armor. Critics said the tanks would be useless in Vietnam. They would bog down in rice paddies and swamps. They would be unable to operate in jungle terrain. They would be vulnerable to mines and rocket-propelled grenades. They would consume enormous amounts of fuel and require extensive maintenance that would be difficult in a combat environment. The critics were wrong. The Centurions proved to be one of the most effective weapon systems Australia deployed to Vietnam. Over 3.5 years of combat operations, 58 Centurions served in country. 42 suffered battle damage. 6 were damaged beyond repair. But only 2 tank crewmen were killed in action, a casualty rate remarkably low given the intensity of combat the tanks experienced. The Centurions' effectiveness came from their combination of mobility, firepower, and protection. Despite their weight, they could operate in terrain that critics had claimed would stop them. Their tracks distributed weight over a large area, giving them lower ground pressure than many lighter vehicles. They could push through jungle that stopped armored personnel carriers. They could ford streams and cross rice paddies that were obstacles to other vehicles. Their armor protection was proof against most enemy weapons. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, armed with rifles, machine guns, and recoilless rifles, could not penetrate Centurion armor. It took the enemy 13 months to acquire and learn to use rocket-propelled grenades capable of penetrating tank armor. Even then, the Centurion's armor was thick enough that many RPG hits failed to penetrate, and their firepower was devastating to enemy positions. The 20-pounder main gun could destroy bunkers at ranges of several hundred meters. High explosive shells could be fired into enemy positions with pinpoint accuracy. Canister rounds turned the main gun into a giant shotgun. firing hundreds of steel balls that could clear vegetation and shred anything in their path. The tanks were used as mobile battering rams, moving at the front of units to make way for armored personnel carriers and infantry through thick jungle. They detonated anti-personnel mines that would have killed or wounded soldiers on foot. They provided fire support that allowed infantry to assault positions that would have been impossible to attack without armor support. The Battle of Coral Balmoral in May 1968 demonstrated the value of the Centurions in the most dramatic way possible. Australian infantry were attacked by a North Vietnamese Army regiment in jungle so thick that armored personnel carriers could barely maneuver. The situation was desperate. The infantry were outnumbered, taking casualties, in danger of being overrun. The Centurions were called forward. Only 2 were combat-ready after a day of heavy fighting. But those 2 tanks, commanded by Lieutenant Jerry McCormick, advanced through jungle that seemed impassable, their massive weight crushing vegetation and small trees, making way for the armored personnel carriers to maneuver and the infantry to regroup. For 40 minutes, the tanks roamed the battlefield, blasting enemy positions one after another with their main guns and machine guns. The North Vietnamese attack broke. The infantry were able to evacuate wounded and consolidate their positions. The tanks had turned a potential disaster into a defensive victory. After Coral Balmoral, Australian infantry did not like operating without tank support. The questions about whether Centurions belonged in Vietnam were answered definitively. By September 1968, the number of Centurions in Vietnam had increased to 28. The tanks participated in operations throughout Phuoc Tuy Province and beyond. They supported infantry assaults on fortified positions. They provided fire support for ambushes. They escorted convoys along roads where the enemy had planted mines. And they inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. The psychological impact of the tanks on enemy forces was similar to the psychological impact of the SAS, though for different reasons. Enemy soldiers who had fought against American forces armed with light armor and helicopters had developed tactics to counter those threats. But they had no effective counter to a 52-ton tank that could destroy bunkers from hundreds of meters away, survive most enemy weapons, and advance through terrain they considered impassable. The combination of capabilities that Australia brought to Vietnam, signals intelligence that could predict enemy movements, special operations forces that could strike anywhere with minimal warning, participation in the most controversial aspects of counterinsurgency warfare, and heavy armor that could operate in terrain where critics said it was impossible, created a force that was far more effective than its relatively small size would suggest. At peak strength in 1969, Australia had approximately 7,600 personnel in Vietnam. The United States had over 500,000, but the Australian contribution to Allied effectiveness was far greater than a simple comparison of numbers would indicate. The Australians operated in Phuoc Tuy Province with a level of tactical autonomy that American forces rarely enjoyed. Their area of operations was large enough to be strategically significant, but small enough that they could develop detailed knowledge of the terrain, the population, and the enemy. They integrated intelligence, special operations, conventional forces, and armor in ways that maximized the effectiveness of each component. They adapted tactics based on experience rather than doctrine imposed from distant headquarters, and they maintained operational security that prevented the enemy from developing effective counters to Australian capabilities. But the secret war Australia fought in Vietnam came at costs that were not only measured in casualties. The involvement in the Phoenix program created moral and legal questions that troubled participants and shocked the Australian public when details eventually emerged. The use of tactics that included assassination, torture, during interrogations, and targeting of civilians suspected of Viet Cong membership violated the laws of war and fundamental principles of justice. Some Australian advisers who participated in Phoenix operations later spoke of their experiences with regret, describing operations where targets were selected based on unreliable intelligence, where innocent people were killed because someone had denounced them for personal reasons, where the program became a tool for settling scores rather than fighting an insurgency. The secrecy surrounding signals intelligence operations created its own problems. The need to protect sources and methods sometimes outweighed the need to share intelligence with commanders who needed it to make tactical decisions. The Battle of Long Tan demonstrated the potentially deadly consequences of overclassification. The tension between operational security and operational effectiveness was never fully resolved. The psychological costs of special operations warfare affected SAS personnel in ways that only became apparent years or decades after the war ended. The intensity of operations, the isolation, the constant danger, the nature of close combat killing, created burdens that some patrol members carried for the rest of their lives. And the political costs of Australia's involvement in Vietnam ultimately undermined the strategic rationale that had driven the commitment in the first place. The war proved highly unpopular and divisive in Australia, just as it did in America. The Viet Cong's Tet Offensive in 1968, though a military failure, convinced many Australians that decisive victory was impossible. Horrific scenes on television screens sapped public support. An anti-war movement gathered momentum, and by 1970 and 1971, hundreds of thousands of people were attending moratorium marches across Australia. Soldiers returning from Vietnam met hostile receptions. They were blamed for a war they had not started and strategies they had not chosen. The government responded to public antipathy by steadily withdrawing troops. The last combat forces arrived home in December 1972. In the end, approximately 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1973. 521 died. Over 3,000 were wounded. 15,381 of those who served were conscripted national servicemen, young men drafted into a war they had not chosen. Of the conscripts, 202 were killed and 1,279 wounded. These casualties were small compared to American losses, but for a nation of Australia's size, they represented a significant proportion of a generation. The secret role Australia played in Vietnam, the signals intelligence that cracked enemy communications, the special operations that created fear out of proportion to their numbers, the participation in controversial programs that operated in legal and moral gray zones, the deployment of heavy armor that critics said would fail, but instead proved devastatingly effective. All of this represented a contribution to the war effort that was far more significant than the relatively small number of Australian personnel would suggest. But it was a contribution that came at costs that Australia is still reckoning with today. The Phoenix program's legacy remains controversial. Some argue it was a necessary response to an enemy that operated among civilians and used terror as a weapon. Others condemn it as a systematic violation of the laws of war that undermined the moral legitimacy of the cause it was meant to serve. The truth, as documents that have been declassified over the decades reveal lies somewhere between these extremes. Phoenix was effective at disrupting Viet Cong infrastructure. It did identify and neutralize genuine enemy operatives, but it also killed innocent people, used torture systematically, operated outside legal constraints, and was exploited for personal and political purposes that had nothing to do with fighting an insurgency. Australian participation in Phoenix was limited compared to American involvement, but it was real, it was deliberate, and it represented choices made by commanders and politicians who believed the ends justified the means. Whether those choices were justified remains a question that different people answer differently based on their values, their experiences, and their understanding of the nature of counterinsurgency warfare. The signals intelligence contribution represented by 547 Signal Troop and other Australian intelligence units was unambiguously valuable. The intelligence they provided saved lives, prevented attacks, enabled successful operations, and gave commanders advantages they would not have had otherwise. But the secrecy surrounding their operations, the overclassification of their intelligence, the tension between protecting sources and using information effectively, created problems that sometimes undermined their effectiveness. The Special Air Service Regiment's operations in Vietnam created a legend that has endured. The Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle, the silent killers who moved through enemy territory like ghosts, these were not exaggerations or propaganda. They were accurate descriptions of what a small number of highly trained, highly motivated soldiers could accomplish through superior tactics, patience, stealth, and an absolute commitment to their mission. But the human costs of that effectiveness, the psychological burdens that patrol members carried, the lives ended or irrevocably changed by the nature of special operations warfare, those costs were real even if they do not appear in the statistics of killed and wounded. The Centurion tanks represented the visible manifestation of Australian effectiveness in Vietnam. They proved that heavy armor could operate in terrain where critics said it was impossible. They saved Australian lives by providing protection and firepower that infantry alone could not achieve. They inflicted disproportionate casualties on enemy forces, but they also represented the industrial scale of modern warfare, the deployment of 52-ton machines designed to kill, the application of technology to the problem of destroying enemy forces. Whether such applications of technology and firepower were appropriate in a counterinsurgency war fought among civilians remains debatable. What is not debatable is that Australia fought a secret war in Vietnam that was far more significant than most people realize. While American forces dominated the headlines with massive operations and overwhelming firepower, while the war was portrayed in media and popular culture as fundamentally an American conflict, Australia was conducting operations that were in some ways more effective, more sophisticated, and more controversial than what the Americans were doing. The small numbers of Australians in Vietnam achieved results that larger American forces could not replicate. They gathered intelligence more effectively. They operated in the jungle more successfully. They adapted to counterinsurgency warfare more quickly. They integrated different capabilities more seamlessly, but they also participated in aspects of the war that raise profound moral questions. They operated in gray zones between military necessity and war crimes. They used methods that would be considered illegal today, and were considered questionable even then. They maintained levels of secrecy that sometimes undermined the effectiveness they were trying to achieve, and in the end, like the Americans, They fought a war that could not be won through military means alone, regardless of how effective their tactics and operations might have been. The strategic failure of the Vietnam War ultimately made tactical successes irrelevant. No amount of signals intelligence, special operations, effectiveness, or armored warfare success could overcome the fundamental problems of fighting a counterinsurgency war in support of a government that lacked popular legitimacy. The secret role Australia played in Vietnam remains largely unknown to most Americans and insufficiently understood even in Australia. It is a story of tactical excellence and strategic failure, of remarkable effectiveness and troubling methods, of small numbers achieving disproportionate results and still not changing the outcome of the war. It is a story that reveals both the capabilities and the limitations of military force in counterinsurgency warfare, both the effectiveness of specialized units and the impossibility of winning a political conflict through military means alone. Decades after the war ended, the Australian contribution to Vietnam remains classified in many respects. Documents are still being declassified. Stories are still being told. Veterans are still processing experiences they had 50 years ago. And historians are still trying to understand how a nation of 10 million people made such a significant contribution to a war fought halfway around the world, and what that contribution meant for the war itself and for the soldiers who fought it. The cable from 1967 that requested Australian support for Phoenix operations described their advisors as having proven uniquely effective. That assessment was accurate. But effectiveness alone does not determine whether actions were justified, whether choices were wise, whether the costs were worth the results. The secret role Australia played in Vietnam was effective in tactical terms. Whether it was justified in moral terms, whether it served Australia's strategic interests, whether the costs in lives and moral compromise were worth the results achieved. These are questions that Australians are still debating, and questions that Americans, largely unaware of what the Australians did in Vietnam, have never seriously considered at all.